Good morning, everybody. It is indeed a pleasure to be here in Adelaide. I'm enjoying my new life out here. I'm going to start by talking just a little bit about responsible sourcing from the demand side, especially, as Alex mentioned, from the auto sector, which is my background. And you can't really talk about responsible sourcing without going back 2 or 3 years to really look at the transition responsible sourcing has been through in that period, from being something that's been critically important, but somewhat confined to compliance teams within auto and ICT brands, across to what we see today, where it really is a business-critical issue, which is dealt with at the C-suite or board level. And the reason really behind that, I'm afraid, is nothing to do with copper, but to do with copper's cousin, cobalt. Now, as many of you will know, 2 or 3 years ago, Amnesty International published an industry-defining report which revealed the prevalence of child labour in at least a fairly significant part of the cobalt production sector in the DRC. And that really was a lightning rod for a reassessment about what we mean by responsible sourcing in the metal sector. For the intervening 1-2 years, auto and ICT brands predominantly completely reassessed their approach to due diligence in this space. But as a few of my colleagues have already mentioned today, the other key impact factor has been the rise of electric vehicles. And with the rise of electric vehicles and the focus on the production of the inputs that go into them, we've seen a diversification away from cobalt towards other metal inputs. So primarily, that was looking at the conditions of production in other battery metals, so lithium-ion battery metals, manganese, nickel, lithium, and graphite. And more recently, a diversification even broader than that to look at other key inputs in the auto sector. And of course, when we're talking about auto, we're talking about copper as a conductor within the cars themselves, especially in EV, but also in terms of powering those vehicles and the emerging wireless power technology as well, where copper will play a critical role. So copper is now very much in the sights of responsible sourcing. I think this slide probably won't be that revelatory to many of you, but I thought it was worth just briefly revisiting the kind of broad risks and issues we face in the copper sector when it comes to responsible sourcing. And that can be social and environmental risks. Again, obviously we have issues related to indigenous rights, to community impact. That's predominantly in Africa, but also in Latin America, in Chile, and of course here in Australia. We have issues around occupational health and safety. But I think, again, as some people have already mentioned this morning, the critical one really is on the environmental and sustainability side. And we're talking here about issues related to water use, of course, and tailings as well, which, as I mentioned, was talked about earlier. And these are the kind of risks, obviously, that are on the decision-making table for procurement teams now in the downstream, specifically in ICT and auto. So I talked about there being a reassessment on what we mean by due diligence, and certainly within the sectors I'm talking about here, ICT and auto, there has been a transition over that 2 to 3 year period. We've gone from having a slightly conservative, reactive, I guess you might say, box-ticking approach to due diligence when it comes to metal sourcing, very much now to a more activist, proactive approach, which is in line with the due diligence guidance being laid out by the OECD, which is very much the thought leader in this space. So you're seeing industry leaders in ICT and auto, companies like Apple on the ICT side, companies like Daimler and Volkswagen and Renault on the auto side going far deeper now when it comes to due diligence in procurement in metals. Now, predominantly, that's in battery metals at the moment, in cobalt and lithium and nickel, but that is moving into a cross-section of their other key inputs, including copper. They're having a much more in-depth approach towards understanding their supply chains, who the key suppliers in their supply chains are, and then identifying what the risks and issues are before working side by side with those suppliers on corrective action plans to deliver improvement. And this is a shift from what we've seen previously. Why has this happened? Well, I think at the top of my presentation I mentioned the work by Amnesty International, and I think they deserve huge credit actually over the last 3 years for bringing responsible sourcing back into the limelight. It had a very strong interest a few years back with 3TG and conflict minerals, but it is now very much a core business issue, and it's down to the advocacy work of groups like Amnesty initially, and then the groups such as Global Witness and some of the other NGOs you can see on the slide, expanding the focus beyond cobalt onto battery metals and then other auto inputs. But again, the other key push factor really has been the media. So if it's the NGO community that have put together the advocacy campaigns around it, it really is the media that has amplified this issue into the mainstream attention. Only last week, I think in fact a week ago today, Bloomberg published a major new investigation into the environmental impact EV demand is having onto the copper and lithium sector in Chile, in fact. I'll share that piece with you later if needed. I think one other piece of observation just here is the other critical factor the media has had is it has taken it outside of the boardroom and outside of multi-stakeholder meetings and actually made it a consumer issue. So this issue of responsible sorting in metals now has transcended the industry, and it's something that the man or woman on the street now would understand in terms of concerns about products they might be buying. You have a new sector in electric vehicles which is heavily marketing itself as virtuous, as green, as sustainable technology, and the media are very much juxtaposing that against the risks people are seeing in the way some of the inputs to these vehicles are being produced. I left this slide in here, but I actually think that the trend we're seeing isn't really being pushed by hard law. It's not really something that's been pushed by policymakers or enforced on the downstream. It's really a market-driven trend. However, there is emerging action being taken at government level, both in Europe, within the EU, in the United States, and at the state level as well. I think I've given some examples very briefly here on Chile. On the pull side, we're starting to see some really interesting, exciting outliers, some industry leaders. I mentioned some earlier in my presentation on the downstream, but even in the upstream now, we're starting to see some producers that are starting to publicly talk about the repositioning they are taking in terms of responsible production. I think Rio Tinto is a good example of that. So, what do we mean by responsible production or responsible sourcing? Well, I think last year at this conference, the speaker who was speaking on responsible sourcing talked about the fact there's a multiplicity of standards, of guidelines, of initiatives in terms of responsible production. That's still the case. It often feels like it's hard to see the wood from the trees, but there are some guiding markers that are starting to emerge, especially within the copper sector. I think the ones to be critically aware of, firstly, the ones I mentioned already. So the OECD due diligence guidance for mineral supply chains. Now for the downstream, this is very much the core reference point for all procurement and due diligence programs internally within the markets that copper is being sold into. So from the supply side, having an understanding about how your practices are aligned with your buyers' perceptions of due diligence is critically important, and the OECD due diligence guidance is the critical reference point there. I've put the LME down here, as again, I'm sure most of you will be aware. They came out with quite a major announcement last year, which is, of course, that all metals now traded on the London Metal Exchange from 2020 will have to be certified as responsibly produced. And the consultation about how that's going to work is out. It's live right now, and will come to a culmination probably in the next quarter. And keeping an eye on what the stipulations around listings on the LME exchange are going to be is going to be, again, an absolutely critical factor for producers. And then finally, even more recently, and I know we have the ICA here today, is the launch, of course, of the copper mark. Now, the copper mark is slightly different. It's not a certification program, it's not a standard, but it is an assurance mechanism that's been specifically put in place to enable producers to make sure they are aligning with best practice. It also allows you to fully assess the risks and material risks related to environmental and social impact that might be in your production facilities. And I think it's well worth assessing the ICA mark now and making sure that you're aligned with the expectations for the copper mark. I think the only other thing worth mentioning here is it's still up in the air as to what the certification for the LME will be. But I think, again, the ICA copper mark now has kind of set a high bar in terms of conformance. And I think that along with the OECD guidance, as I said, having an understanding of how to be aligned with the ICA copper mark will be critical. So we've talked already today, and the speakers have highlighted the fact that very much the theme of the conference this year is on data and technology. I mean, as much as we've seen an increase in scrutiny around responsible sourcing, we've seen just as big an increase in the tech input on the sector, racing to try and find tech solutions to these issues. And these really coalesce around two issues. So the first is transforming the way we assess and monitor upstream production. At the moment, as many of you will know, you'll probably be sent audit requests periodically on an annual basis. The big game in town now is changing that towards constant, almost real-time monitoring of mine site conditions of production. There are already systems in place that are going to be doing that, which will enable your buyers, which will enable the downstream to keep a constant monitoring of conditions, but also to be given immediate red flags if there's any environmental or social incidents or risks that come into play in the upstream. And then the other area, again, is the word which seems to be synonymous in virtually every sector at the moment, is of course blockchain. And there are a number of interesting pilots going on within the metals sector now about how blockchain can be used to deliver a provenance and assurance through the supply chain to end user, so that the end users, car companies and the ICT companies I mentioned earlier, can make evidenced claims against the responsible production of the key metals and materials in their products. So, for example, in cobalt, there's a use case being piloted right now between Ford and Volkswagen in the downstream, between LG Chem at the refiner level, and Huayou Cobalt in the upstream. And if this use case is proven, then it will have dramatic impact potentially for the commodity sector more generally, and prove that blockchain can be applied in mineral supply chains. I think my plea to you today actually is that I know some of the technology providers, including my previous employer, are very keen to speak with the copper sector about replicating this model within copper. Copper is the obvious choice for a blockchain-backed solution. You have a very well-controlled production environment in the upstream that will lend itself to be traced through the supply chain. And I can talk more about blockchain later in the day. I guess I've got a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to end just by saying I'm actually quite bullish or quite positive about copper within the context of responsible sourcing. If you look at it from a comparative perspective related to the other metals I mentioned at the top of the presentation, actually copper's very well placed to leverage itself as a responsibly produced material. It's predominantly not produced in what are considered conflict-affected or high-risk environments. Production is heavily industrialized, advanced, and well controlled, and the product itself, as some of the speakers have already mentioned, is the perfect modern commodity to fit into the circular economy. It's, I've said infinitely recyclable, it's not quite true, but it's very recyclable. A third of global demand is met by recycled copper already. And as I think Alex mentioned, it is a vital conductor for the modern technology, which you see all over your newspapers every day, specifically electric vehicles. So I think copper is very well placed to fit into this new market dynamic. As for Australia, and I think actually this goes for Chile as well, there is an opportunity for producers in these two markets to be a champion of copper. One of the problems the sector has seen over the last year is actually more to do with the perception gap rather than reality. I've seen journalists, I've seen analysts, even people from within the copper sector misinterpret the production process of copper and conflate it with more high-risk production methods. And that perception gap needs to be closed, and people need to be educated about the comparative sustainability, both in terms of production and in terms of the commodity, when it comes to copper. And I think there's a huge opportunity for Chilean and Australian producers to take up that industry leadership role. In terms of next steps, I've already mentioned some of them. I think the absolute bare minimum needs to be having that understanding around the key standards and guidance material that I mentioned earlier. I'd be getting in early now to do an alignment assessment around the risks and issues in my operations, so that you can actually start to set the narrative about responsible sourcing in copper before scrutiny rises to the levels we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years, as I just mentioned, in copper, in nickel, and in lithium. And my final point, and this goes for the clients that I work with on a near daily basis, is talk to them. They are desperately keen to engage, not just on a procurement level, but on a thematic level, to talk about responsible sourcing. So engage directly with auto and ICT. Join all of the various multi-stakeholder forums that are emerging around responsible sourcing, and engage with the media and report on the action that you are taking. And I think if this can be done, there is a real opportunity for copper to be seen as an industry leader in terms of responsible production. And I'm exactly on time.